Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about outliers and what an outlier does to a data set. So it's really important that you actually acknowledge outliers in a data set. You need to be able to identify that it is actually an outlier and then know what it does, particularly to our measures of center. So an outlier itself is an extreme value in the data. Now that can be way, way higher than the rest or way, way lower than the rest. But generally, if you were to draw a scatter plot, it would sit really outside of the bulk of the data. It would be very noticeable sitting outside. Now, technically, you can classify data as an outlier if it is more than twice the interquartile range from the median. So if you work out the interquartile range, double it, and that amount from the median, and you find that there's data outside of that, either below or above, then it is considered an outlier. If it is more than 2.5 times the standard deviation from the mean. So both interquartile range and standard deviation are measures of spread, of how spread out that data is. Standard deviation tells you how far away from the mean that data is. So if it is more than 2.5 times the standard deviation that you work out away from the mean, then it is also considered an outlier. So let's have a quick look of an example and see what actually happens to some of our measures of center when we have an outlier. So this here, we've got a new coach working with long jump people. Athletes' performance have changed, and so he's collated all of how far they can jump. So Augustus, Tom, June, Carol, and Bob have all improved. Unfortunately, Sam got worse. So what's actually happened is normally you would expect the mean to sit within the middle of the data. So if I were to put this over here, so I've got, basically they're kind of clustered around here. So I've got one sort of here, I've got one sort of here, and then one about here, here, kind of all in and around together there. And then I've got little Sam all down here. That's Sam. So you can see that most of the data is here, Sam all the way down here. So while the data set kind of sits up here, Sam sits down here. What happens is when we calculate the mean will actually sit just here. Now, that's an issue because this is where the bulk of the data set is. But because of Sam's result, it drags it down. Now, the reason that outliers have a particularly large effect on the mean as opposed to the median or the mode has to do with the fact that mean is calculated by adding the value of the data, whereas median and mode are just about frequency and position within the data set, not about what the value of the actual data. So when you calculate mean, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, 5. Okay, so this is our data set. To calculate mean, you have to actually add all of these, 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 5, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 divided by 6. Because you're adding values, if you've got a value that's really large, so if I were to add like 23 onto here, that would mean that while I'm only dividing by 7, I'm adding a really large, that top number will actually end up being really large. And when I divide it by 7, it just won't bring the number down enough to sit within that. So having a really large outlier that sits way too high away from the data will result in a mean being way too far up. Conversely, when you've got all of these numbers, yeah, and then you get this tiny number way down out of the data set, because you're then dividing by a larger number but only adding the smallest part, it brings the mean down. When you look at finding median, even if I add 23 there, it's just about finding the middle. So this is the middle here. So even if I add like 0.1 here and I add 123 over here, my median's still 4. And even if I don't add this one, all I'm actually doing, so if I don't add that, then my median is actually in between 4 and 5. Still, adding two giant numbers doesn't change it because I'm not looking at value. So how big or small that data is doesn't matter when it comes to median, nor with mode, because mode, all I'm looking for is the most recurring. So here it's 3 and 5. So unless I've got several outliers that are the same, then it may, but most times it won't affect mode either. But mean, major effect because you're adding values.